Good evening, everybody. On behalf of Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, I welcome all of you for the faculty MIDS faculty seminar series. Actually, that faculty seminar series is a platform for the MIDS faculties to present their recent research work. So far, since 1971, there are more than 500 seminar series. Yeah, more than 500 seminar has been taken place here. Today, we have another one faculty seminar series. We have the speaker. Dr. A. Kalayarasan. He is an assistant professor in MIDS and he is also Fulbright scholar. He has presented so many articles in referred journals, and also he used to write to newspapers about the contemporary issues. And also that let me introduce chair Professor Badmini Swaminathan. She is a former director of Madras Institute of Development Studies. Her study area is gender, education, labor problems, health and welfare of state and the nation. Let me welcome Dr. Kalayarasan for his presentations. Okay.
Good afternoon, friends and colleagues, and Professor. Thank you, Manoj, for the generous introduction. And I have to make one confession and a caveat. First confession: this is the work that something that I have been. Okay. Can you make little adjust? Yes, we should ensure that. Yeah. Confess it. Since Professor Badmini Swaminathan is chairing, is something that I have an understanding or maybe an experience with her. Any paper that I go through or I write, and if she goes through that paper, then I'm pretty confident that I can handle the world if she approves it. In that sense, hopefully that I satisfy her today with my skills that I had with, particularly with the data. So if we'll have to see that how much I succeeded today in this endeavor. The caveat, of course, this is a work under progress, and it's very patchy in a way, it's very descriptive. And only thing I've done is some kind of mapping kind of voluminous data processed in and look at and see the pattern, and if something we can make sense of that pattern and think about theorizing it. For certainly that another caveat, and also I have to say one more caveat I have to make, which is something this work that I've been discussing with Professor Anandi in particular of understanding, because the gender question, again, the way the economic look at the gender question, women question is quite different from the way sociologists and historians look at it. So anytime I discuss with her with some data and she gets excited, then what I get excited, because I just show the numbers, but she get excited. So these are all some of the conversation that actually motivated me to enter into this area. So the argument broadly, I actually in fact wanted to do a little more detail, just not confined to the economic domain alone. I in fact wanted to make a connection between economy and society and polity in the larger sense in the state, how the economic aspect, particularly the women participation in economic aspect, interacts with the other domain and other scholarship. But in this presentation, I'm going to strictly confine to the economic aspect, and broadly I'm going to map set of variables which generally economists use, in particularly those who work on labor economics. Largely those variables are labor force participation rate, work participation rate, wages, earnings, and occupations. And these are all just fairly evaluate based on the data sets that's available. And I see clearly these patterns are shaped by largely what one calls as a gender norms. And even you look at the state interventions, looks like largely these are all certain preliminary claims that I'm making. I'm going to substantiate this through the presentation. The state interventions are largely rooted in the supply side, less on the demand. And paradoxical, particular again, is definitely I see that's I think the major claim is improved representation in economy, in the sense in a broader, I'll show you what that I mean by improved economy in detail. And I also see that improved representation of women also been accompanied by huge level of in particularly of the wage gap and occupational segregation, or one can call as informality in a broader sense in the workspaces. So the data sets largely use here, this is something in fact I mentioned in 93, 94, in fact I've done quite a bit from 83, 84 onwards, which is generally these data sets are available in the public domain. This is, there's something called unit level here, that's typically economics users go in detail and process it in a range of softwares, and you get the series over a time from 83, 93, 94, 99, 2004, 5, 9, 11, 12. But since 2012, there's a change that took place in Indian statistical system. They've changed this employment, the method of employment surveys, which earlier used to be called as a quinquennial survey, every 5 years used to take place. Even they also changed little methodological inside of the way that the sampling is done. So that actually called, the later series called as a periodic labor force survey, which began in 2017-18. That's the first time India introduced. And there's a lot debate on whether this PLFS is comparable with NSSO, EPW are full of that debates around. But there's a settlement of the debate is, with certain caveats, you can certainly compare. That's a news. So therefore, we are actually safe in that too, if you're comparing, say, with NSSO old series with the PLFS latest one. So to complement this, there's also a big debate again among the feminist economics in particular. The survey-based data sets do not really capture the woman work, particularly unpaid woman work, and therefore the new data system was introduced again to the statistical system the first time. It's called time use survey, which actually was introduced in 2019. And there was a pilot survey was done in 98, but that's not comparable. The only thing available in public for usage is time use survey. Why this matters? Because one of the concerns of the feminist economics for a long time is the survey data sets do not capture the woman work adequately. And what we get this as a woman participation, woman range of variables, very limited aspect of the woman would actually, women tend to do more than what actually this data captures. So that's become big debate. So somehow the time use survey was expected to capture or fill that gap. So I also use that survey also to see the difference that we see from the earlier data sets. And comparability, as I mentioned, now it's a little bit I'm comparing here. And again, another caveat which is generally used within labor economics. In India, someone talks about employment, unemployment, something called UPSs, usual status, weekly status, and daily status. These are all certain variables. One can go in detail. Basically, to make simple one-line statement, any variable you use, that variable should be longer reference period, comparable. In the sense, if you are looking at, say, woman condition of work, you should not use a starter variable, which is the daily status, because it fluctuates much faster. So I am using the first one, UPSs, which actually generally captures the longer period of woman work, which is basically nothing but a reference period that one would ask in the question in the interview, like how many days you have been working, how many months you have been working. So this is called 360 year. This is something called UPSs. Principal and subsidiary status. So now get back to the state story. This is an estimation I made myself with using certain kind of assumptions from the census data to make actual workforce. This is an accurate workforce today in Tamil Nadu. And you see the trend over a period of time, 93, 94 to it's almost 3 decades of the workforce. So what is the takeaway? There's a lot of numbers here. The takeaway, I would say, one takeaway, which is straightforward, is the agriculture, which used to be the base of the livelihood, many would still think as agriculture, is no longer so. In the sense, if you look at these figures in the first row, which used to be, it is in million, But if you look at it, translate that into the total workforce, that size would roughly be, for a woman alone, it will be 35, but for overall, it's less than 30. And that size has been declining, even in absolute numbers. So probably this is a big debate again, economists. The first time in Indian history, particularly Indian post-independent history, the 2004-5 onwards, there was an absolute decline in agriculture. So far, the decline used to be the relative decline. In the sense, you look at the share of the workforce. Why that matters is, literally people are moving from rural to urban. That's what it means. And Tamil Nadu being one of the most urbanized state and as seen as a great degree of structural transformation, substantial workforce has moved from agriculture to industry. Just to give one number, you can just look at the first row, from 15 million to it has become 8.5 million in 2018-19, which is almost half of the workforce left. So that workforce needs to be observed in industry or services, or you call it one more column, you have a non-manufacturing. Non-manufacturing includes in a statistical terms construction and electricity and set of variables, set of sectors, but you can think of as a proxy to construction, which is the third one. So now the major driver of growth in that sense for employment growth happened to be the service sector, and it used to be the manufacturing initially. But one of the second, I would call as a second claim that I'm making here, in the later point I would actually keep talking about, is the decline. This is a big debate, and again, I have to make this a very well known. I assume that people are aware of this declining story of female work participation. I would argue here, this stagnation in the manufacturing. Look at the second row, it was in 5 million, and it actually gone up to 6.3 and remained around 6.5, and in fact came down to 5.8. Same to be, it is almost stagnant around. But it does not mean that manufacturing has not grown in our, if you look at the GDP figure, income figure, actually certainly has grown. And our manufacturing share in employment would be roughly 19%. And the output also pretty much, almost, in fact, much one of the higher, relative sense, it's as a better share, equivalent to, you can call Gujarat and Maharashtra. But point here is, this has not been a successful as a driver of employment, despite Tamil Nadu having a broad manufacturing base, has not been able to increase the size of the workforce. This is particularly for women. Why this matters? This is well articulated literature. Again, Professor Sri Dashpananda and others have now almost come to the conclusion with the claim that the major decline that we see, which I'll show you later in the next slide, for the woman, this change from agriculture to industry, this transformation, what you call from rural to urbanization, rural to urban, has drastically, unevenly impacted the people livelihood, particularly gender. Women tend to lose in this structural transformation. As a result, I'll tell you how that process takes place over, as a couple of slides more. But this is the broad story. Today, and one more thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about Tamil Nadu urbanization, structural transformation, one more thing we do, our TFR has been declining for a long time. So as a result, we don't have to add additional workforce to the industry. So look at maybe the fifth or the last one, population. You can take, say, almost, it has gone up from 5.57 million to 7.6 crore or 76 million. But in a relative scale, our TFR has been declining for a long time. So as a result, you are not really bringing additional workforce to. But still, our dependence, since our TFR has been declining, and the dependence ratio, which is work population ratio, which you may think of as the last column, has gone up. So in the sense, what the broad story is, our TFR is declining, our employment, we are not bringing a lot of people addition to it. What is actually important is the shift of the workforce from one sector to other sector. So how that shift or the transformation you call as economics call as a structural transformation from low productive agriculture industry, high productive manufacturing and service impacted the different gender, particularly for women. That's the story. So now let's look at the structure of women population. Around the same period, you clearly see the percentage of the population which are in workforce in 1994 was 53%, and it became 2018. Look at 33, almost 1/3. 2/3 of population are outside of the workforce. Essentially, that's the first slide, first cut. The second question is, what are they doing? This 2/3 people who are outside, if they really wanted to work, are they not getting work? Which economists generally use this term called, people typically use this labor force participation, workforce participation, and unemployment rate. I need to define these three variables, which are very key for understanding the story well. In India, conceptually, unemployment rate plus WPR equivalent to your labor force participation rate, assuming there are people who are actually seeking employment actively and not getting employment. Therefore, unemployment is existing. That's unemployment by definition. This is a section of population which is seeking. But in this question, the people who left are in the workforce, it's not the case that they are seeking actively. Look at that second row, and it is almost similar. It is marginally has gone up in 2018-19. So there's a literature out in the, again, economic literature. The women actually are more attached to family. This is again questionable norms, but this is another explanation given than the labor market in a changing in a scenario. But it is not always the case. This is one of the typology of the claim is made. But I think more than that, more than gender norms, one can also think of this in a broader sense, not just to women alone, even the men too. In a changing, particularly in a developing economy, story of unemployment is not as important as underemployment in that concern, because people are, when they are poor, are by necessity they will find a way to get some livelihood, even if they don't get employment they think they want to get, or the employment that they think it's remunerative, but they may not get it, but still they would find a way to. So therefore, in the developing economy, what is important generally considered is the broader sense, is the quality of what you call underemployment. But educated workforce, the unemployment story mix, because I have not given the figure here, which is actually significant, much higher in the sense, you could even go double digit in that sense. But otherwise, if you take the total population and cross tabulate, unemployment is not the serious problem. Therefore, I here generally use, when I say the women participation, I use interchangeably what you call WPR and labor force participation, which is the difference between this is the unemployment rate. So now your workforce, as I mentioned, women, 2/3 of women are outside of the labor work world. So what are these women doing? 2/3. And just break that those who are out of work, you can see the fourth column. We see definitely that is actually sign of, one can think as an empowerment. There is a substantial population, particularly in the size of the lower age, particularly called youth, young women, are getting into education, which actually is testimony of our Tamil Nadu story of what you call as one of the highest in terms of GER, in terms of higher education, which you can clearly see the pattern that see from, say, fourth one, which is from 4.5% to 11.9%, almost doubled between this 30 years, which is essentially, I would say, those women largely would be in the higher education. So, but that story alone, even if you control that, account that, that is not the main reason why you have this decline. The first row decline, which is 53% to, it went off of the workforce, it became to 1/3 of the workforce. Since 1/3, the decline cannot simply be attributable just because the woman actually gone into higher education, particularly young women. I think the larger things are in making. That is actually larger, I mean, that's detail. The truth lies in details. The details will go one by one. So the entire part of that, I mean, it's a substantial section of this presentation going to explain this, why this percentage of the domestic duty, which is reported as a 35%, has gone up to 42 in that sense. It's a big number in that sense. It's already, one more thing we need to give. It is not the case that it was 53 is considered to be high. Again, even earlier it was half of the workforce. It was already low. So despite being low, it further declined. That is actually the concern. So Tamil Nadu story is no exception to the broader trend too. This is something, this statistics for Tamil Nadu, but actually you can think of the statistics like as if just replaced with India, the trend would be similar. But the only difference is this. The difference between the Tamil Nadu and the rest of India is the trend and the pattern are similar. The only difference is, if you look at across time, almost from the beginning, from 93-94 onwards, almost 10 percentage point you see the difference between the national average and the Tamil Nadu average. I also looked at from the major developed states, not the Goa and other unitary territory, which are actually, in fact, you see the much representation of women. If you look at the major developed states like Gujarat and Maharashtra, similarly placed thing, and Tamil Nadu again does almost similar level of better than this. But the trend almost will be similar. We have to keep in mind we're only looking at here the levels in between these states. Definitely in the state actually does well in that, and you see even if you take the it could be possible in state women may be doing well here as compared to the say another entity called our pan-Indian average, but still the gap between women and men would be much higher, which you call as a relative position. Is that the case compared to Tamil Nadu with the other? If you could, the second slide actually you can see, which is called, I took the ratio of the working, of the woman share, women working with the ratio with the men working. If you look at that, there too you see the differences. So in that sense, the levels and the rate are the ratios, relative position. In both terms, the work participation is relatively better. So this is the broad. So now the question is, what is the concern then? Concern is, but still if you look at the men and women participation, you see the difference. Here is the first slide. See, in fact, it widened over a time, particularly from 2011 to 2017-18. I think this is the period 2017-18. You take any variable, employment variable, you see the decline. From unemployment rate to wages to most of the indicators seen as a kind of a lot of shocks around that period, which disproportionately affected women, that many see, particularly informal sector and other demonetization, range of things happen. But it's well documented. For Tamil Nadu also, I get one can think of this. It's not completely an exception to what has happened in the national level, but see the differences. You can clearly see, despite state women being relatively better participating in the economy, but if you look at the men-women debate, still it's a substantial. And this decline, which you see the decline of 17-19, no, I have to make one more caveat here. You may see the figure. Any figure I show the decline here is confined until 2018, 18-19. So now there is a debate, which you can also see from I took the average of 19 and 21, which is 2-year average, and see there is a turnaround happening. This turnaround, I would say, not the turnaround of empowerment. I'll substantiate that claim. This turnaround, not only for Tamil Nadu, even for all India, this turnaround came largely in the agriculture. If you break that, where this turnaround, the employment or the participation has gone up, which even the government actually said that suddenly, there were arguments made, including Balla and others in the national newspapers, that there is a turnaround happening in an employment story of women. This turnaround is not a positive turnaround. Therefore, we'll still stick with our story of the 18-19 for the decline, because this turnaround is a distress-driven COVID and other thing happening. So, but our story, main story, it's low and has been declining. And the decline largely, if you break rural-urban, this is where the structural transformation question comes into. The decline has been largely in the rural, not in the urban. Look at the second graph at the bottom one. Almost you see the stagnancy. There is a marginal decline, but the larger decline came from the rural area. So this rural decline is consistent with the other studies, range of studies now done on now, explaining female work participation. It is, this is a consensus I would argue, which also shown in I have shown in the earlier structural transformation percentage of the workforce. It is largely story of the agriculture, moving population from agriculture to industry and unable to observe definitely the population that is not getting observed in the industry, and it's question of the demand, I would say largely. So because it's clearly the rural is a question. Of course, other stories are also involved in it, which is education and other socio-economic factors. We'll discuss one by one. Look at the education, as I mentioned, definitely education played an important role, and enrollment, increase in the enrollment has certainly impacted negatively in that sense in the shorter run. In the longer run, having a degree or having education would be better off. So in the shorter run, definitely there is a decline because women suddenly withdrawn from the workforce, it's gone into the education. But there is again a literature within economics which says, again, structural transformation story in a big story sense, is generally connection link between the relationship between education and the work participation of women is what they call as a U-shape, in the sense initially the illiterate would have a more better representation because poor and your necessity you be part of the workforce. But the intermediate, higher secondary generally would be lower, and once you get education, you have a better chance of getting observed in the industry, which is called as a U-shaped curve. But assumption is over a period of time it's supposed to flat, in the sense, the population everybody should be educated and the industry structure should be such that it should absorb. But somehow I think changes in the economic structure you do not see here is happening. Definitely the one who has a middle level education is also losing here. The illiterate definitely by necessity have to work. Educated women get a chance to work, whereas the intermediary or the higher secondary education still is the low. You can take across, maybe the degree would vary, and you see definitely there is a pattern that U shape here continues to be. Particularly the third one, higher secondary and the secondary education, having education is not guaranteeing any work for women in that sense. The women who are better off in the sense, it's simply a participation. Again, the participation is not a guarantee that they get a better wages. We'll come back to later. We are only questioning now, thinking of the participation, entry into the work. And this is actually well documented. Tamil Nadu is no exception. Another story, which is the age and women work, this is also supposed to be, in fact, it should be inverted. It should be a inverted U, in the sense, initially young age you are not, and as a middle age you are supposed to have more workforce, more work in the participation. The trend actually varies. For our own takeaway, you can take away here is the age of 15 to 24, which is a consistent story that I mentioned earlier. The substantial participation part of the women in young age has gone into higher education. You see clearly the decline from 2004-5, which was 42% of that age group were in the workforce, and which has come to almost half of them, 21, which is, I would say, is definitely the product of the outcome of the educational enrollment. And clearly, and the middle age, obviously, as you move, and definitely you get a better representation. It is actually consistent. This is not, and also as you work, job experience also matters, because age, those who do the econometric analysis, age they take as an experience. They put a double dummy to this and multiply it and take as an experience, proxy for experience, which is pretty actually salient in many studies. And this is actually quite consistent with the pattern of decline we observe in other part of the world. So now, particularly the Indian case, Tamil Nadu case no exception, caste and whether there is any connection, definitely there is a connection. I will also show in the income also poor tend to work more as compared to the rich. And here you also see which is purely necessity. It's you can't afford to, I don't have an employment story. You have to find a way, which is get reported in the data also. So that is definitely, you see the almost 10 percentage point, which is consistent over a period of time, as a difference between Dalit and the non-Dalit, and which is purely driven by the necessity. I clearly see it. So therefore, one of the things that we think of in India unemployment rate, we should not think more on unemployment, more underemployment, in the sense return to the labor or the wages or the work condition, that equally matters. Not just if you want to assess the well-being of the change in if you want to track the performance of the economy, not just in unemployment rate, you should also look at the wages and the other aspects. So that's one can think of if you want to make a larger inference from here. And if you look at the quintile, which is the class and women work, and clearly you also see that as the poor tend to work, particularly bottom 2 quintile, and here which is 1819 and 2021 gives me little not misleading but lesser for the poor, but still if you take the last 2 quintile together, and definitely that's actually bottom actually tend to work more as compared to the richer quintile, which is the Q5, and which is consistent with most of the stories. And this is also important. This could be, it's well documented again. The woman actually going into the labor market, coming out of the labor market, entry and exit has been much more flexible compared to men. There's a study, people do that, show that the number of times that women in lifetime enter into the labor market and exit in the labor market is much higher for women than the men, for range of reasons. It could be, family, social, that we can discuss in the range of aspect. We can see the why that persists. But so that is also another reason that you see because if that is the year that you see tend to the surveys done, and if you see the exit and you are outside of the workforce. So this entry exit also makes a huge difference, and the trend is quite similar. Of course, the level would differ from Tamil Nadu and all India. The trend would similar. And here it's also another well documented literature, which is in the Tamil Nadu case is Judith Ayer's work. She did it, I think, in Tripur story around, and when the economic was prospering around, I think it's late 2000, and around that's we call as a we call India's golden period of growth and development. You have double-digit growth, and Tamil Nadu is also a booming economy. Tirupur was booming around, and that time she actually had a surprising findings that when men actually the household income actually gone up, the men started imposing the woman that you don't have to work. Basically, it says the woman became, she calls that process as a housewifeification. In the sense, making woman as housewife is the status symbol as your income increases in the household. But this thesis needs to be tested again, because how much this thesis alone would explain for the total decline. But this also is operating. That we need to. That's called feminist, or feminist broadly called as status production. In the sense, family, this is called social norm, gender norm. So when we use this word social norm, gender norm influencing the work, is this one of those norm which influencing? That's again by secondary data, ethnographic data, many actually have documented this. In Tamil Nadu case, this is Judy Tayar. And again, whether a marital status matters, marriage matters, this again is big, contested debate whether the marriage alone would decide withdrawal of the woman workforce or joining the workforce. I think here looks like from my data it needs to be, perhaps this is from just over a trend. I checked with the cross check with the over a time, different time period, and you see clearly it is not just a marriage. I think it's a more than the marriage alone, because a married woman also reported having doing more participation than the unmarried or never married woman in this case. So I'm not sure the marriage alone, but the literature suggests that the marital status alone is not the reason for withdrawal of the workforce or even the change in the work status. It is more of the dependency at the household. Why this dependency matter? Having more children, that actually would influence the work participation than simply change your marital status from unmarried to married. If you are well qualified, if you get a job, I think you continue to do. Perhaps the more influence, more shocks comes at the household level, changing the preference of the work, perhaps is the dependency, the care, the domestic, the demand that comes from the domestic aspects. That we can discuss more detail. There's a lot of rich data that's available in time use survey, in the sense who takes care of the household and how the caregiving, all that matters in deciding the woman work. So whether the location matters, again, this is I think it's connected to the question that I was earlier mentioning, the structural transformation question. This is it's a district level data. I just made a map out of it, and look at the participation. Broadly, the poorer regions, the regions which are more agrarian oriented in terms of the share of the workforce, actually show the better representation of the participation, which is a consistent in the sense in a traditional thing, women tend to work supporting the family farms and other stuff, poor and directly connected to it. The moment you changes economy from rural to urban is the story, in the sense relocating, mobility, education, employment opportunity, all of that decides the decision woman getting into work. Whereas if you are in a village, you are connected to the farm, you tend to show you are assisting or directly, here assuming you have to say here the work could be anything. It is not really very remunerative, whether the wage labor, whether you are assisting home, there are a range of it. Simply is asking whether you are under working, there is a definition called SNA, which is the statistical account system, which will fall under you are making some productive engagement. In that sense, they are productive, engaged with the farm and other in rural. So therefore, you have a correlation. But in the urban area, which I already shown in the earlier, only in the urban area the level is the very flat. In the rural area, it was high and declining. That declining is perhaps, which also matches here, is the change in the workforce transforming from agriculture to industry. So summary of this broad trend of the participation. Range of factors influences, income influences, age influences, caste influences, marital status influences, location, all matters in deciding the woman participating in the industry. Just simply a participation, whether they are better off, whether work conditions okay, whether they are getting a better wages, these are all questions that we are going to discuss in detail. And in this story, I make having accounting all of this, which requires a clear econometric exercise, but I tend to make based on my descriptive overall trend. And certainly, actually, the demand side would be the who determines the supply side in that sense for accounting the low and declining. This, despite the fact that the state has been consistently higher than the national average and other states. Now, question is that the case that whether women who work woman who reported as work is the one is actually working, and the woman who is not reported as working is not actually working. Are they not doing a productive activity? Remember that the first question, 2/3 of women actually outside of them. Some of them are in the higher education, but rest of majority of them reported, almost 42% of them are reported as working in or doing a domestic activity. Let's unpack that domestic activity through this time use survey. What is this time use survey? I have to give a little bit of introduction to this time use survey. What this time use survey is, basically in 24 hours, you just sit with the respondent, ask starting from 4 a.m. in the morning, next 4 a.m. This is what last 24 hours, what you have been doing. Systematic account of the each hours of the work, each minutes of the work. So in that, if simple first cut, almost 34% only reported as doing any economic activity. We don't have here the amount of economic activity. And whereas 90% of the women reported they did some form of domestic activity. Whereas just look at the corresponding men figure, only 24% of men responded saying that they did some kind of, which is, I am not telling a magnitude, size of the thing I am not giving. I am only reporting that they worked in. I'll give you in the next slide, I'll give you the magnitude, how much time actually gone in domestic. So that since is substantial, which is actually connected to the question whether your marital status or the children or the dependency, household, all that matters is because of this, is because definitely this would be eating up hours or availability of women for or supply side in the sense in the work, for availability of work. Sheer number, the difference, look at the from 24 to 19, in that sense Tamil Nadu is in fact relatively worse than the men in that sense, taking care, doing any domestic activities as compared to national level, but 93, 91, 90 and 91 almost similar for national level. Just contrast this figure with the actual time spent. In total 24 hours, you divide the 24 hours into minutes, which works out to be 1440 minutes. Out of 1440 minutes, women tend to spend their minutes almost 231 minutes into the doing domestic work alone, and compare the time that men spends on for doing that domestic activity, which is just 20 minutes in a day, which is just huge different, the scale at which is not different. This is almost quite similar to in fact it is lesser than in the pan-Indian level trend. And this is also, even if this is for the age group of 15 to 59, I don't know whether I did have I have some figures, but you can even look at the age group, youth, which is young generation, which unlike the millennial other stories of gender parity, but is not, the data is not showing that. In fact, you the substantial variation, even the youth time spent on domestic activity or sharing any domestic activity as compared to women. Almost this is about 231 and 90. You just take the denominator and take the percentage of it, how much the differ would be. Huge differences. I think this is, although this is an important factor, I would not say this is single most factor for the decline, but this unequal of the household, unequal of the domestic sphere. Again, even the caregiving, you look at the caregiving again clearly, because the caregiving matters the number of dependency of the household that women actually take care, which actually decides their ability to go to the market. So all of this connected story, and we can go more detail of the socializing, communication, and how much each of this women spend. You clearly see the gender variation to it. For our job, just we take these two aspects. One is the domestic care and the domestic time that one spends on it. And this is a youth story, and clearly you can see the men actually tend to have more on the economic side, and the women tend to more on the domestic side. But this is again the supply side. But is it the case if given a chance, if there is a better job available in every sense, better wages and the work condition, everything is good, perhaps this may be shared. Again, we'll have to check the controlling other variables. Is there any scope of showing how much this alone defines the withdrawal of the workforce or the less workforce? So broadly, we can, from this time use survey, we can make another claim, which is that time use survey definitely make women work more legible, women world, not just in the workspaces, number of hours and world, also even the domestic spheres and the time they spend on the unequal level. And so clearly Tamil Nadu is no exception to this gendered domestic world, which many women. So now the question is, this we have actually two parts. One is the mapping from the old survey data sets of the women participation and function determination. We see clearly pattern. And we also looked at the time use survey, looking at actually how there's any variation in the time spent, allocation spent on household and non-household or the productive activities. We clearly see the trend. Now we are going to look at those who reported as working, which is at 1/3, which is 34%, 33%. What is their condition? How are they doing in their workspaces? Are they better off? There are any differences in that? First, let's take a call and the broader trend. You see in the Tamil Nadu, in that sense, comparatively, more women tend to work outside the agriculture, traditional sector. In the sense of more represented, which is well documented again, more in the service, manufacturing, and non-manufacturing, which would be construction. So, if you look at the manufacturing alone, this is running, circulating in the Twitter by Ashoka has been circulating. This is from the. I have calculated, this is the figure, the map, the first one, it's both the figures from my own calculation from the data. The bottom variable one, which is only from the formal sector, which is from the ASI data, Ashwini Deshpande calculated it, their team, and they show for the recent, I think in 2017, if I'm right, of the total factory sector in India, one out of two women working in Tamil Nadu. In the sense, almost 43% of the women reported working in a factory sector are located in Tamil Nadu. In the sense, that is actually the extent in which the manufacturing is important. But even if that is only factory sector as a formal, if you include the informal, which is what NSSO does, which includes the formal, informal together, take the manufacturing alone, almost 28% of the total women workforce working in manufacturing are in Tamil Nadu. And the second distance, which is compared to Maharashtra, which is the second one, third one is Gujarat, which the other two are most developed states. And even then, they were not able to diversify the workforce, particularly for a woman, outside of the agriculture. But again, I will have to make a caveat. The moment you say that this is a better off, does it mean they are actually really better off in terms of wages? Does this mean really they are actually getting the better work condition in the manufacturing? We have to wait for that. It is only the first cut there. They have been moved from the agriculture to industry. We'll go in detail, and you also see the clear pattern over a period of time. You take from the bottom one is the second slide, bottom one is the 2004-5, and look at from 2022, there is a marginal increase in the share of the agriculture, which I said the distress driven, we can go in detail, but broadly the story is the women, as in the following the broad story of the state, moved from agriculture to manufacturing and other sector. And how this actually compared or stand with the other national or the state level experience. This is simply called as you have a two graph. First graph is which you call as a type of the work. When you say the woman is working, what kind of, you have to check which sector they are working, which occupation they are doing, or which kind of work they are doing. If you take the first one, type of work, which is called as a economic type in the NSSO data sets, almost you can think of say 35% in the Tamil Nadu case is reported as a self-employment here. The self-employment here is a very ambiguous category. It could be a professional doctor, it could be simply assisting in a village farm, as a laborer. If you look at the third one, unpaid family labor, could also be called as a self-employed in the reporting. If the national statistics NSSO says the self-employed, we have to be very careful as to what do you mean by the self-employed. We have to ask them, unpack that self-employed. If you unpack the self-employed, you get this three category and see the substantial population of women who reported as self-employed, who are actually counted in the national statistics, which is called SNA, the UN-based SNA. Still, they are actually called as unpaid labor within the self-employed category. So, if this is but in that, if you compare with the rest of the states, and still Tamil Nadu too is no exception, it is almost 15% of the workforce, women who reported as self-employed as unpaid within. This is actually counted as a work. I am not talking about the people who are not counted. We already put them. We are talking about the 1/3 of the population. Remember? So, but the good thing here is, whereas Tamil Nadu is concerned, almost 27% reported as a regularly employed, and substantial again, almost 35% said as a casual laborer. So, in that sense, you will have to think of, and we don't know we just keep this casual labor out. Anyway, casual labor you are working, it is not going to be seen as a very remunerative, in a way, casual laborer. We first take those people who reported as a self-employed, And is there any earning differences between men and women? How good they are the earning within the self-employment? And similarly, we also look at those who reported as regularly employed. Is there any wage difference between men and women? How better off they are? And as I mentioned earlier, the compared to other states, of course, Tamil Nadu stands differently from this in terms of better diversification. Here is the main, the story is the main. This is actually the most concern for me, in the sense, of course, Tamil Nadu also follows the rest of India in terms of decline and share, etc., but relatively does better in terms of participation, moving out of agriculture, manufacturing, etc. But the most important concern, which is, I think, not come across, this is actually looked at from the data carefully, and clearly you see the pattern in terms of wages. Huge. This I would call, it's a gap, I would say. Whether this gap, which called as a gender earning gap, in terms of regular wages, wage gap it's generally called, even in there's a gap, substantial gap in the self-employed category. Remember, the large percentage of women reported as a self-employed. So now you think of that participation of the woman with this wages or with this earning, you see the men-women difference is huge. It could be simply the women are actually assisting the men or maybe doing a lesser productive activities as compared to men in the self-employed category. Whereas in this regularly employed, again this is shocking because it's called regularly employed, which is considered to be the equivalent in that sense. You see the substantial difference in it. And this difference is to be seen if you unpack. I'll tell you the story why that difference exists. I took this explained because many people think when you see the differences in terms of wages, that's actually, I mean, this is generally some economists also do the mistake thinking of as a direct discrimination if you see the gender gap in wages. But need not be the case. It could simply be occupational differences in the sense within the hierarchy of the firm. It could be possible women are placed at the lower end or middle rung as compared to the top rung. This is from MIDS. This is actually my own fictional story. The number is actual number, MIDS top number, but the salary attributed to each of the categories my own. I just attributed the salary for the faculties is 1 lakh for per month, you take it, and non-teaching 50,000 and sanitation 30,000. And I made identical salary for men and women. Since there's a disproportionate woman participating in the sanitary and the non-teaching, you see the difference in the bottom. Almost on average, MIDS pays its women 20% less than men. So, but it actually, this is what the statistics also would show, national survey, to say if you look at the wage gap, you take the average, it takes the averages in that sector. But that average actually conceals the information that actually whether it's discrimination would be the identical category. When you have a human capital, education, everything you control, there's a way, it's called in econometrics, they called Oaxaca blinded decomposition. They control to controlling the range of other identities, other variables, how much the penalty, discrimination alone contributes. But if you take simply this case here, I'm showing, it could be simply occupational segregation. So there may be possibility that women actually entering into the labor force, that labor force is not randomly distributed across sectors. If there is a pattern that emerges, that pattern is largely I can do that. I did bit of the occupational, there's this NCO within the data sets who can do that. But this is sufficient enough for a discussion that it is not necessarily to be a discrimination in the labor market. It could be simply the occupational segregation. It's because it's a fictional account, because I made identical salary for all men and women. But since it is disproportionately represented in the non-teaching and sanitation, if you take the total average of the wage, you actually see the differences, which called as a gender wage gap. So this could be the factor, what is happening here in a broader, as a state whole, as even a country whole. You'll have to really disaggregate and go in detail and do certain kind of exercise to identify that. So self-employment, again, this needs a further inquiry as to why this huge level, and this gap is much higher than the other states. Important. But despite the state being a modern, entering into the sector, but it looks like they are very unpaid or not unpaid, low paid jobs or occupational segregation in the workplaces. That needs to be accounted. Another puzzling figure came out for me is If you look at, there's a variable within, it's just to the government sector or the public sector, percentage of women working in public sector. Take the public sector as a whole and look at the gender distribution. You see almost 65% of the total public sector are controlled by women, manned by women, in the sense managed by women. I was actually shocked. How could this be? Because there's a certain intervention was done in the state, which is a reservation for women in '89. That could be played a role. But this level of 65% of the state missionaries, because this is reported as simply as a woman working in public sector. We don't know this woman actually working in government departments, or as a casual laborer, or even it could be NRGA as a casual laborers. Because in the statistics it gets you as a public sector. It could be a range of things. So when you go disaggregate it, definitely there is a substantial number reported as a casual laborer, but in the government sector. So we'll have to be very careful as to say if there's definitely the woman actually more at the lower end of the clerical level in the state. Definitely one can go with the secondary data and other sources. But there's also possibility more of the casualization, subcontractual plus the NRGA could be the thing. And this sector gap also persists in the not just the public sector or even the formal, private, also in the, if you can see the differences in the manufacturing and services, and you clearly see the differences, the wage gap, which is very, very important, substantial, and in fact much higher than many states in that city. And distribution, I did not go into the differences wages within women and within men. You just Lorentz curve is sufficient. The distance you can clearly see from the central line, which is the deviation, or the distance, which is the coefficient. You get a Gini coefficient based on that, and you clearly see the women when you reported working are not uniformly placed. Even there is a wider variation within women, as I mentioned. It could be few numbers would be in the higher rung, and the majority would be in the middle rung, and the substantial would be at the bottom. And that differences in the earnings would get reflected in the Lorentz curve. We see the clearly distribution. You see the coefficient is high, and this is the MIDS story. I explained how that operates. So the workflows, definitely workforce is diversified, which is thanks to the structural transformation that Tamil Nadu has undergone, and which is substantial, no less, which is almost, I say, for all India average, agriculture dependency for the national workforce is 40 plus 44. It has in fact gone now recently to 45. Tamil Nadu has been maintaining less than 30, which is a good thing in the sense you are actually modernized workforce. You took a population outside of agriculture, rural to urban and industry, but that is not really, that may be a necessary condition, maybe initial stuff. The next challenges that you have is this occupational variation in the workplaces you find, and the wages you find the gap in the modern sector. I think that's something needs to be highlighted. Now the state intervention, if you think about it, state intervention, definitely the education. Yeah, just one last slide, madam, just one more slide. Education, definitely, we know that it's been emphasized on education skills. There are recent policies, range of things we see, and this state support has been largely on the three accounts. One is improving education, which is again supply side, and the mobility for transport, that kind of infrastructure. And the third is about making women available at the domestic sphere, making their life easier through the freebies and population. But yet, you can all do this provided there is a job outside there. Transport can take the woman from the home to the work, but you need to find a work, which is what called as a demand. So this is actually the more of the supply side intervention. I think the problem lies now, looks like more in the demand side story. And caste, we can go in detail actually how the caste and gender interacts here, deciding certain pattern. I can take this question in the question and answers. And broadly trend is, we have evaluated labor force participation, WPR, wages, earnings, occupation. And trend is, as I mentioned, clearly there's one level it is seen as an achievement, as in a progress, but another level you also come across with the substantial level of wage gap and discrimination, and it is low, and definitely, but compared to the national average of the other states, in terms of level and also of the diversification and the relative position, this is better. But the question here is more of the wage gap and occupational segregation. But most importantly, the declining manufacturing is my concern, which has become actually for a long time, for a recent time, particularly for the last 10 years, it has not been, despite the state emphasis on manufacturing and a lot of factories we see the investment MOU, but I don't think that is actually turning around making more employment growth in the manufacturing. Because that has a direct connection with the woman question. And therefore, woman empowerment is to be seen not as a 0-1, which is called as a dichotomous variable. It has to be seen as a continuous variable. It is like a degree of participation. I think stop here. Thank you. Thank you for my listening. Please.
You want to take your laptop or?
Can you close it? We can just close it. There.
Good evening, and I want to begin by thanking MIDS for having me here today. It's nice to come back after a long time. I think the last time I came here was also for Kalai's seminar. Let me also begin by congratulating Kalai. I think it was a very neat presentation, very lucid, and I think you made your point very clearly, right? So I'm going to start with a question. So Kalai, where do you think you're going from here? Let me come to that. How do I arrive at that particular question? Where do you go from here? Let me start with the paradox that you have mentioned. And what is the paradox that you have in Tamil Nadu is the state has otherwise achieved remarkable gender parity in higher education and narrowed down its literacy gap, but such gains in education have not got translated into higher participation of women in economic life. So that's the central this thing that you're making. Now, for decline in female labor force participation, literature has three sets of explanation. One is increase in educational attendance, status effect, and persistence of social stigma against females working outside their homes. Right? You have mentioned these three. I should also mention that Kalai has sent me his draft in earlier, so I was able to read through the draft, and my comments are based on the draft that he had actually sent me. So thank you, Kalai, for having sent it to me. Now, what we do not have is credible official data corroborating decline in female labor force participation with the above explanation, the three things that you have actually mentioned, and actually how much does each of the explanations contributes to the decline. So we have different sets of feminists arguing it could be status, it could be income effect, it could be this, it could be that, more people being in education and so on and so forth. But what is it that each one of them actually contributes is not what official data actually is able to tell us this thing. That table that you had, which in your draft was actually table 2, Kalai, was education and work. Okay? So what I found in that table, education and work, I found it extremely interesting, but I found that it needs further disaggregation. Now, what are the things that I'm talking about when I'm talking about? You want to put up that particular table, Kalai, that or I can just stop.
Oh, yes, yeah, please, I guess.
I'll just stop. Yeah, I'll just stop. No problem. Sorry, I'll just stop. Yeah. So what I found is that, one, since we are claiming decrease in literacy gap and remarkable achievement in gender parity even in higher education, what numbers of women are we talking about? So if you take the category illiteracy, now if you saying that Tamil Nadu has done very well and they have achieved parity at the lower level and at the higher level there is the gap that is occurring, then when you take the category illiteracy, what numbers are you talking about? Really? Actually. So what my question to you is, if you take the category illiteracy, can you disaggregate the data by caste, marital status and region? So if you do that, are we talking of a very small number or you're talking of because if you put it in percentages, it could seem very big. Say almost 50 to 60% of the illiterate people are working, but that could be a very small, the base could be very small. Okay, so that is one thing. Two, at what stage of education do you find gender gap increasing? And at what stage does education and employment diverge for Tamil Nadu women? Right. Now, three, comparison of women workforce in Tamil Nadu with other states makes TN women come out smelling like roses. But a little later, you also mentioned this achievement of women's entry into employment is not inclusion as they suffer from wage discrimination and often end up in low productive jobs in informal sectors. So that part of it you have really explained. All the time what we do is that political reasons we may be comparing Tamil Nadu with other states. But what we need to do for our own sake is compare Tamil Nadu with Tamil Nadu. So compare 10 years of Tamil Nadu earlier and 10 years now later, where have we reached, and is the wage discrimination actually decreasing, increasing, what is it actually happening? Because otherwise we always think, oh, we are much better than this, we are much better than that, and that's a political slogan. We don't want to get into those kinds of this thing. Is there some way you can locate data on a few of these sectors, map the tasks that men and women workers perform, find out which of these tasks are designated skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled, and what are the wages against each of these tasks? And that is why, Kalai, I think the MIDS story is very interesting. Because what you are actually showing is particularly this. So, when we did about in the late 90s, when Vijay Bhaskar, myself and Jayaranjan, when we did a study of Tirupur, one of the things that we did was we met the CITU union, trade union, because every 3 years they have a wage agreement. And instead of going around and asking them, why are you discriminating against women, why are you doing this, why are you doing that, we just told them what is the task that men and women do in the knitwear industry, and where are the women concentrated, where are the men concentrated, and where do men and women are equal, and all of that. And very clearly you see a pattern that you have an n number of tasks that has been listed. We got a list from the trade union, and we found that whichever tasks the women were doing were designated either as semi-skilled or unskilled and paid very low wages. Now they had no clear idea as to why they were designated as unskilled or semi-skilled, but it was designated as such and the payment was very low. So very clearly it is almost similar to the MIDS story that you are actually talking about. So where are the women actually located? And I don't think it should be very difficult to get in certain sectors. You take the teaching sector, you said that Tamil Nadu government has reserved. Long back the DMK had reserved the lower level primary classes to women teachers. Now many of the men then started saying the lower classes given to you, why are you now competing with us at the higher level? So what would be the salary gap at the higher level? Does that still hold? So if you take some of these particular sectors and start doing, I think you start working towards an explanation for this gender gap that you're actually talking about, and then also trying to find out, are we really talking about discrimination or occupational segregation that you have mentioned? Fourth, your section on does region matter? In one of that, I found that also, and I found it very interesting, but I also find that it is waiting to be explored. Okay, poorer and economically backward districts show higher participation in labor market. All of us understand that poorer and economically backward districts show higher participation in labor market. Now, because you had sent me the paper, I had the data. I compared in your data, you compare Ariyarur with say Chennai. I'm just taking those two. You have compared many of the backward districts which say Chennai and all these places which are much distinct. Now, can I infer that economically richer districts like Chennai, which are also educationally rich, I presume, however, have very little to offer women in terms of employment? Because if you're saying that in Ariyalur, which is a backward district, I have almost 50 to 60% of the women in agriculture participating there, it is a poorer district that you're talking about, and they are still in agriculture or something. And here you have Chennai, which is a rich district and which is also educationally rich, and I have only 24%. Now, once again, Kalai, the problem there would be, what is the population of Ariyalur that you're talking about? What is the women's population there? If men have moved out of there and the women are only left there, I think there is a more complex story that you'll have to show. Because if you just take these particular percentages, it seems like suddenly 60% in Ariyalur, and then you're talking about 24% in Chennai. When Chennai 24%, what does it translate into? And what does 62% of Ariyalur actually translate into? So that is the one question that I have. Then, but there is also a caveat. Karur and Namakkal, which are well-off districts, show higher participation in the labour market. So my question to you is, what are you inferring from all of this? The next important point made by you is that the gender earning gap in Tamil Nadu is one of the highest in the country. Details of this gap are highlighted across sectors, but are we any closer to an explanation? I think that's an extremely important point that comes out of your entire presentation, and I think we need to also start exploring, are we any closer to that? Thereafter, then your paper talks about welfare measures of Tamil Nadu government, gendered social norms, all of that. You've got each of which is important, but does not individually or even collectively as yet enable us to understand why Tamil Nadu's economic development is neither arresting decline in female labor force participation nor translating into better quality employment for its female population. So the question that I would like to ask you is, where do you go from here? Now, one suggestion I have, I'm just giving all these points and then throw it open to you. Don't have to answer all of these now. I have one suggestion would be to examine the disparity in wages. Is to do that particular exercise in more detail, the disparity in wages. It may be relatively easier to get data on sectors of employment and study which tasks command what wages and which gender is assigned what task. For example, in the health sector, disproportionately larger numbers of women are employed at low levels. So all the ASHA workers and all of those workers are women workers, so you don't have to go very far, you'll get those, Similarly, in the education sector, reserving lower classes for women may have increased their participation, but at low levels of salary where compared to teachers of higher classes. In other words, such sectoral examination will help us come closer to explaining why female labor force participation is relatively high in Tamil Nadu, together with gender disparity in wages. Now, since we come from the discipline of economics, there is a certain mindset about what kind of literature that we actually read. And it's taken us a long time to actually read other kinds of literature. I'll just quickly give you what I'm talking about here. There are a couple of very interesting studies of what is called an ethnographic study of wages. One of them has been done by Professor Harilal of CDS, his student, Eliamma, Maitri Eliamma. Dhani, I forget her name, but I can give you the reference to her thing, which is published in Contributions to Indian Sociology. Now, what she has done is that she has actually tried to understand how wages are arrived at in the construction sector in this thing. And to cut a long story, it's a very long paper, it's a very complex paper to read, but what is a thing that she's actually saying is that the trade union, the construction sector, I mean whichever firm is the construction, which was L&T that she studied I think in Kerala, the trade union and the local level mafia, I mean say local governments and all those people. Now they have a big say in how wages are arrived at. So here in economics, when you're talking about this, you're talking about, for this star there is this work and this, that and everything. Now over there, when they're doing this kind of work on the ethnographic study of this thing, there's a very clear pattern emerging as to how those wages are determined. So finally, what is she actually saying is that 70% of the unskilled workers in the construction sector will be decided by the unions. And which will be these unions? There's a whole lot of unions there. But the union which is the strongest at that point of time and which may be even closer to the ruling party, now that will have the bulk of the say in recruitment of these unskilled workers. And they will decide at what wages that worker will be hired at. So where is the question of any kind of how wages are particularly determined? The other thing is that because there are union workers. So when the union brings their workers, the company has no control over these workers. How much longer they will work, whether they will come, they will not come, and so on and so forth. They don't have any of this thing. So what is the other 30%? It is at the discretion of the company. The other 30% are most of the migrant workers who come. Now you could have a union worker and a migrant worker being side by side, but the migrant worker being paid half the wages of what the union worker. The other important point that she brings out is, between the Malayali male and the Malayali women worker, there is a wage gap. Nobody understands why there is a gap, but there is a gender gap. But even the Malayali women's wage is more than the migrant workers' wage. So this is I'm giving you a very short summary of what that paper, ethnographic study of wages of that particular paper is. The second thing that you're talking about, say Manrega workers. Our own student Anne George, when she did the Kudumbashree workers study in this thing, which is published in 2014 in the Indian Journal of Labour Economics. Now, what does she point out is that when the sanitation work was handed over from the corporation to Kudumbashree, then they ceased to become sanitary workers with all the as government workers. So now the Kudumbashree comes under the poverty alleviation program. So because it comes under the poverty alleviation program, it commands very, very low wages. If they were municipal corporation workers or sanitary workers, they would have got a different kind of a thing with all the perks and everything that goes along with this thing. But simply because it got over into this thing, Kudumbashree work, which is a poverty alleviation program, then the payment of these wages with none of these perks became acceptable to them. They're in paid work, they're getting some work, all of that is fine, and there is women empowerment. But you need to understand how these things are actually done. Right? So there is also a study of the way the in the Durgapur industrial belt, a thesis that I examined this thing, which actually also spoke about the same thing, about how the union, how the party in power decides who the workers have to be, how much the workers will be paid if they're union workers, and how migrant workers will be paid. So there is a different story altogether if we start reading some other literature. But I'm saying right now, the better thing would be to examine this particular task that you're talking about, of this difference in wages that you're talking about. Because for us to collect data on the declining thing, it's a very complex thing. There are many, many micro-level studies that have been done about the declining work participation, and each one of those explanations are valid. The status, the income, all of that is actually valid, but it is very difficult now to say this accounts for this much or that accounts for it. So we end up with just saying it could be this, it could be that, it could be this, but maybe a better thing would be, the second part of your story is the disparity in wages that you would like to do. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for having taken so much time, but now the discussion is open to the, yeah. Yes, sir. I think Kala, you can continue.
My name is Surinarayan. I'm a volunteer in the academy. I want to associate myself with Madam Chairperson in complimenting the young scholar for the highly informative and analytical work that you are doing. Because for me, we have not done much work on this subject. It has been highly informative. Years ago, in the Panchayat elections were held with 30% reservation for women. I was associated at that time with Madras University. And along with a colleague of mine, the Professor Lustig, we did a survey of the various candidates who stood for the election and asked them what are their priorities. Madam, it's highly interesting to note that most of the women candidates said education is their top priority, whereas the men candidates said water supply, construction of various sectors. And that gave us a keen insight into the realization of ordinary women that education is the only way for us. I'll give you an illustration. You attend the convocation of Madras University, and you will find 80% of the gold medals and the prizes go to girls. More than 80%. That shows how much they are committed in the field. But that is not reflected as to writing in the appointment to the teaching post in the university. I do not know how many of these gold medalists and prize winners belong to the upper caste. And therefore, advertisement they mention backward class, backward class, and only 31% go to the open category. Can we make a suggestion in the case of women there should be no reservations, that all can go and their number can go to be used. I leave it to you for your consideration.
Can we have others?
Two more, very small one. I have many more, but I will not bore you with that. Madam, you mentioned about unionization. I do not know how many of them are really unionized. The union which is there is the favor to the government, along with the government may decide to do. Do they get the benefits that the ordinary worker gets? Do they get casual leave, ordinary leave, sick leave, pension benefits, etc.? How many of them do get that? And I think it's one area where you should do more work and enlighten us. The last one is that which you not touch, which I am giving you a suggestion for your future work. Government of India has banned the export of laborers to the Middle Eastern world. But that is violated, and there are many women who go there and men go subjected to a lot of exploitation. In fact, Sri Lanka is one country which does not have any ban. And if you go early in the morning, if the airport is full of young girls between 18 and 30 years going to work to the West Asian country. And that has led to a lot of not only problems relating to women, but also to breakdown of families in Sri Lanka. I wish that you, having done this much of work, you also do some work in this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you once.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Kadai. Thanks for the presentation. My question is again on education and what kind of an impact it has on labor market participation and all that. So since you presented data from the Time Use Survey, something that the Time Use Survey also talks about is the relationship between women's education and the time that they spend on unpaid work, care work and so on. So if we compare these estimates, what we see is that with increasing education, there is an increased participation in unpaid work in India. And it's more or less true for Tamil Nadu as well. And this is starkly different from what we see in the American Time Use Survey and in the larger Western literature that says that with more education, participation in domestic work reduces. But again, with India, the double burden, triple burden, all of those issues come into the picture. But what we see here with the Time Use Survey is that illiterate women and women with middle schooling and high schooling spend almost the same amount of time on unpaid work. Education does not play a role at all. So women with higher education spend less time on unpaid work, and of course women without any education, illiterate, spend more time on unpaid work. But the category that's really vulnerable here is the category in between, the semi-educated women who are also semi-skilled. So these are the women that are also employed, and even when they are employed in all of these vulnerable lower-level jobs in companies, other firms, so on and so forth, where they're probably not really able to get the wages that they should be getting, but they're also impacted by the domestic burden that is placed upon them. So this category, and again when there are more intersectionalities with caste and class and all that, this becomes worse. So do you have a comment on this, and have you looked at this data, the data on the semi-educated women who are the most vulnerable towards unpaid domestic work and care work as well?
Yeah,
I'm Mani, a retired person. I'm ceding a point to them which it has no relevance to this topic at all. One point of my concern is these workers in the security field and some areas, they are working 12 hours a day. They don't get a single day leave. In some societies, they manage to run the show with one person. And in some societies, you run with two people. And they are working 360 days. This is subject for the institute to keep it as a seed. And why it cannot be changed? In the B-Day, we celebrate May Day It was fought after killing about 4 people in US, Chicago. Then we succeeded in getting 8 hours a day. And only the unprivileged security people, they work 16 hours, 12 hours a day. So this, anything, as human beings, we have to do something about it. Because these fellows are working not a single day leave. If one wants to attend some function, he is at the mercy of the other person. 365 days, 24 into 7 they are working. Why this discrimination in our society? Why not we set an example in Tamil Nadu and give a solution to all over the world? So this is my question. Take it as a subject for your department. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, actually it's not really
Low down is
kind of thing.
Funny.
It's fairly very exhaustive kind of data that you've got. Probably I'm not able to make sense of a lot of the numbers other than what you highlight. But I'm just wondering, the very title of Dravidian paradox. Because, you know, the title is little puzzling. Partly I think it is a phenomenon about kind of expansion of spectrum of opportunities that has become available, say from 90s to what has been available by 20s across India. And due to various reasons, not necessarily anything to do with the Dravidian aspect of development. It is something to do with the context of the 90s to 2020. This whole range of opportunities that has been made available mainly to women with education and some level of, mobility, caste and class. Now, one of the important things is when you connect welfare programs and the labor force participation, and you talk about paradoxes, whereas what I see here from your own narration, from the numbers, there seem to be some kind of assumptions, some kind of inherent kind of inbuilt patriarchal norms and values that go into making of welfare programs, as well as the manner in which labor force participation is diversified across class and caste. Now, if there is a kind of a tie-up between welfare program and the labor force participation, how do we really understand the paradox, and particularly as a Dravidian paradox? So this is something I'm just trying to get something out of this.
One second, sir. Just hold on for a minute. You want to say something?
Yes, fine. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Maybe after this I'll take a...
Yeah.
Yes, sir. It's a very insightful paper. I just wanted to know, this Tamil Nadu government is going to roll out this 1,000 rupees for household women from this September. And it has already started to roll out this financial assistance for the college going women, 1,000 rupees per month. And do you think whether these kind of initiatives of the government, particularly this Dravidian government, will have any further impact on this gender gap or wage gap? And how do you consider this, making women in the domestic duty as a kind of by paying 1,000 rupees per month, whether that accounts to any kind of labor market, or how you see that process?
One second, please. Are you?
Actually, your subject about this Dravidian paradox and talking of gender pay gap and so on, it's a subject which is absolutely dear to my heart, given the fact that I am from working with women workers as a trade union in Tamil Nadu for more than 20 years. So many things what you were explaining by data is what I'm observing in the field, and that
that's why many things you and Padmini are saying, they strike such a strong chord. What she said about what you're talking when you're talking of gender pay gap and why women are not coming to work and so on, and what explains this. Do you know today that the government of Tamil Nadu has placed amendment to the Factories Act to make it a 12-hour work day? Yeah. Now, we were in our organization, our immediate concern now, everyone is only saying one thing, we all need to be on the street to prevent that. And we are being told by our other colleagues, for everyone, for factory workers. So once if it's for factory workers, then of course the unorganized anyway fall into that. So, and we are being told this is being promoted specifically because it has happened in Karnataka and Telangana, where Foxconn has and other international companies are. But again, I want to say one thing, what your data is really important here is that you're showing that workforce participation rates of women are not increasing. And there must be some reason, because the lack of decent work, lack of employment in good conditions. I am seeing their occupational health of women who are working even 8 or 10 hours a day. They are not able to work for more than 2 years. And then you're talking these massive breaks, number of breaks of women from employment. It is not only because of family, it's often because of their health. Their husbands and sons are telling them, better you sit at home than go out and work in these disastrous conditions. I know workers in the modern sector, like in canteens and all that. You know, earlier they were farm labor. But when they came to the canteens, they had got some kind of diseases or things, which made them, their families to spend more money to make them okay. Similarly, we are talking of chemical industries, which Tamil Nadu has invested in, pharmaceutical industry. There are no kind of occupational health surveys. I'm seeing cancer, I'm seeing various types of ailments. And so, what I'm trying to say is here, wage, working conditions, hours of work, the transport, you can say it's free, but it is not accessible to working women. If I want to go to a temple where time and all that doesn't matter, it's fine. But if I have to be at my workplace at 7 in the morning and it's done by 7:02, then I have to punch by a certain time. Free transport doesn't work. Last, I want to know, I want MIDS not to use the word freebies. I don't like it when academics use such words, because this is the words which economists, journalists use. These, we have to define social welfare and freebies, and we have to have a commitment to building social security systems and being critical of certain types of things, and also what the kind of what we are talking of now, what people are saying is the Dravidian model. This is something we really need to question, because one thing that Anandi also has mentioned, that the National Family Health Surveys are showing women facing violence in Tamil Nadu. So all these factors have to really help us to come to some policy suggestions. And Mr. Jayarajan is there. Yeah, but it can be done. It should be done. We have it.
After that, then we have some.
Yeah, well, a response to that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kalai, for the wonderful presentation that you had. So you were trying to give us a You're trying to build an argument saying that there is, of course, there is a decline in labor force participation. You're trying to explain why it happens. Maybe there is some kind of understanding between the supply and the demand side that we can arrive at to explain it. That is women's preference for flexible work and the lack of, or maybe the creation of a masculine type of work that we're talking about when we say factory work. So when we say that more women in India are actually employed in the manufacturing sector, maybe you can disaggregate it saying which, in their reproductive cycle, who is actually in the manufacturing sector and why is that there is a decline happening. Maybe it is the nature of work itself that is preventing women from sustaining themselves in the kind of work, because from my own micro study, level study, says that women continue to be overcrowded in certain lower working conditions simply because of the flexibility it offers and because they are able to manage home. So it is all of this which forces women to be occupied in particular places.
Very quickly.
Please go.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Was just wondering, can we seriously factor in caste? I mean, not just Dalits and non-Dalits, maybe Dalits and other, vast number of castes, right? Not just Dalits and poor. I think we need to kind of do a very, very interventionist study in terms of caste. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll respond to the first question, the semi-education and public. Again, yeah, as I mentioned, the time you serve it, I think it's a well documented. So yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's also well documented. Perhaps I would start with, Madam mentioned that when you use the education and workforce, we need to give the weight of each of these categories. In the sense that illiterate, primary, normally economists divide into 4 groups. That's a typically standard. It's illiterate, primary, and the secondary, higher secondary, then the graduate. Perhaps what is the change that has taken place now? Perhaps since so much education enrollment happened and different weights, each of this weight, how much in the total it matters in terms of the weight of this. So in that definitely we'll have to check how much that semi-educated, which actually corresponds to the secondary school education, how much that weight in the overall. We can easily calculate that. And one thing that actually is also happening here, this is from the supply side. On the demand side, story is, this is again documented from tangents, not on the explaining female work participation. There is this literature which deals with effectively on the changing relationship between technology and work, where it says that certain job which is called as routinized, which is called as a productive, being like mechanized in the sense of automated or computer penetration of ICT into it, made redundant or become very thing. But I think the main victim of that change would be this category of this low skill, middle skill, but not unskilled. Unskilled anyway, the computer or the other thing can't handle. Not high skill, which requires anyway. I think this middle level one is the secondary IRS. See, the woman earlier used to be part of that. Now what is happening to that thing? We should be definitely. I think that's a broad thing. On the domestic and the education, I think it's a lot domestic part and the education. Why the educated woman, generally there's an inverse relationship with the post-study. But I think it requires more inquiry as to why that is still, despite the education, why the role of women in caregiving is not coming down, or participation in the domestic activity hasn't come down. The big question is, and just I understand that where it comes from. So, I have not thought about much about the normative aspect of the Dravidian thing. Definitely what I have in mind was, as Madam mentioned that you see the one level of degree of inclusion, because this is happening now. I started using this word paradox because a month before, it was circulating in Twitter as to this employment figure of the manufacturing, how the state actually stops in the list. I mean, someone shared with me, even had a telephonic call, but even the media guy one from Delhi school asked me, how do you explain this, what is happening? The many thing that here is something remarkably happening. So that is also an entry point for me to go more deeper into the issue of what is unpacking the world of work and the condition of the work. So what this literature does not mention is the degree of participation they mention, but do not mention more discussion about the natural quality of the work. So when I look at that, then you clearly see the pattern where you have an entry which not necessarily mean is a great thing, empowering, but it is seen as a mobility, better than being at home and getting a, but not necessarily to be seen in that way, unless it comes with a better condition, either the work condition in terms of contract and the work condition, or in terms of wages, which clearly I am not look at the work condition, the terms of contract, which actually has was mentioned that I need to do a ethnographic kind of work as to normally the wages need not be determined by the market trend, market determination, what economists typically think of the supply demand factors. It could also be the other non-institutional other factors which the paper that is mentioning. So all that I need requires work, but what doable from the data I did with the wages clearly see that, but again that was the explanation as to why the difference. But this is not only to say the paradiser guarantee is not to say that not to make a bigger claim just because someone more participation. You need to look at what kind of participation is that, how remunerative, how good condition. So then you see there's a definitely of the more complex story than the black and white story of empowerment versus non-empowerment. That's what I want to use the word for that. And I definitely get your thing. I completely agree that it's in fact here also the share of wages in the GVA, in the total GVA has been declining for a long time. Second indicator data also suggests from AHA data to look at the contractualization to the fact the share of the main worker versus the contract has been increasing for a long time. This would be directly connected to the work of this changing the factory. There was also initial amendment of the standing order amendment, what is core and non-core activities within a factory that facilitates the subcontract of the workers. You would have to hire the workers in the regular thing. You can basically changing the go in detail of the legal terms of it. Basically changing the legal law in such a way that it actually facilitates contractors. So that is happening for a long time. Absolutely no second opinion. The data also substantiates. But only thing is it has to be seen with the larger context and what is happening. That more requires more of the field work, ethnographic based data, and also occupational thing requires different kind of inquiry. But something which I promise as I going to respond to the intervention also, definitely I need to do a very thorough econometric analysis to say what accounts how much. Since I've been taking everything is account influences, but we need to clearly see among the factors what are actually the key determinants of it. I'm sure for wages there are econometric exercise can be done, which are similarly for the determinants of the participation also, the work participation also can be there. But I think that needs to be again supported by some kind of ethnographic, taking some case study and having doing field work. That would actually give us much more detailed, richer analysis. And the nature of work versus sectoral connection. Yeah, that's very much because now manufacturing service also the difference in that usually economists have to make has been blurring. In this sense, what is considered to be manufacturing is not actually manufacturing many things actually. In some way, becoming servicification is happening. So similarly, I think this is a medical literature. It's not about the supply side; it's the demands kind of the work available that actually decides the. This is also my story in the sense why this is happening in a way of the trouble. Because earlier it was tied to the forming and it is actually reported as a working, but actually may not be remunerated. It is not even paid well. But whereas now in the urban domain, it is actually this greater factor decides to stepping out of home and going to the job, work condition, availability, distance and service situation there, better, all of this. So unless that actually really matches the requirement of the woman, availability of the job, I don't think the greater factors plays than what used to be the case before or in the rural context. That also perhaps the reason why Ariyur was better. We need not see Ariyur is better in that sense compared to Chennai, because Chennai to get a job step out, range of factors I need to account into go to take that particular job. Whereas in Rajaguru, it's just that because my land is there, or maybe my husband has left to city, now I have to take care over. Therefore, I could be reported as a working, but which may not be seen as definitely requires more detailed work. But I think that's a story again. Graded caste, I think I completely agree. It's a graded inequality system. It should not be seen as a binary thing. Again, unfortunately, the data set that we have actually that's very limited. It's called as administrative categories like partial. So it does not tell us much of the richer gradation and also the differences within each of these categories is very, some of them in fact hierarchical within. So it needs to be unpacked and require that fast as possible only when you do a kind of field work which requires different resources going to field and understanding. But data actually does not do, unfortunately. Therefore we all play with that what is available. And Madam, actually thank you again for being very rigorous as always, and it was very helpful. Definitely, I will promise that I will do this the thorough econometric analysis to account each of these factors of these determinants in the first part of the participation, because I am only giving the descriptive account of each of the factors to see how much matters, basically to get the clarity. Second, definitely there is a possibility of doing the wage gap with there's a lot of econometric analysis. And maybe, if this funding or possibility emerges of the field work to support this to exercise. But whatever the data, that will definitely promise that I will get this. Then now I have also acquired some clarity as to what is my idea was also to test these numbers and see any pattern emerges, and I can then pattern it back and rework that. I think that's probably my response.
Is there anything that you need to comment at the 1,000 rupees?
Yeah. So actually it's a good thing, definitely, given you have seen the work condition, all the poorer level of employment opportunity. The second level of even those who are working also running is a huge gap. But only thing is that cannot be substitute for the work. That can be complemented to the work. That's the only thing. Because if you see, because at the end of the day you need to I'm educated, I want to get a job, you need to create a job opportunity and to make a work condition possible. There are other factors. So that could be an added on, in the sense, may not be a solution, a substitute for having a job or making job available, also making a supply side intervention to make this other transition possible. But cannot be a complement, not a substitute. That much only I can say.
There's one person who wants to ask.
I just have one question.
Can you just stand up and get in mic?
So you were talking about the Time News survey, which tells us that women spend about 232 minutes, around 232 minutes in a day on household chores, while men spend about 20 minutes in a day on household activities. So I was just thinking whether there are any kind of potential policy measures or behavioral interventions that the government can come up with to encourage to motivate family members, to encourage women to join the workforce, or can anything be done from a policy angle?
I was open to it, but I can think of this intervention two ways of this. Again, changing the social norms, which actually requires, I think it's a huge, it's not like you can unpack sociology, not less than economic, more of sociology.
I can help you with the answer.
Yeah, please.
I can help. I'll help Kalai with the answer for that. I think it's not for the government. I think it's for the male members in that household to do something about it. And Agenda 2030, I'm not saying it at a trivial level. I'm saying that the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, goal number 5 is on gender equality. And one of the things that the feminists have critiqued is, they are saying we don't want this word sharing. We want the male force to take responsibility. So they're actually changing the terminology and saying enough of the sharing and keep on requesting men to share. It is actually a responsibility that men have to shoulder. So members of the household have to take on that particular responsibility if you want to move towards, I mean, there is this much the government can do. And we don't want the government entering into our homes for everything. Let me also just quickly answer our friend who said about the security. The point there, sir, is we are not getting into we know those security personnel being exploited and all that. From the academic angle and from the policy or economist work, there are contractors there are these agencies who do that. And what the struggle has been of the unionists, of people, activists and all of them is to actually get this, because we do have the Contract Labour Act, we do have all of these things in place. But getting them to register and getting the contractors to register the number of people who are working there has been something which has been, non-starter in this country. So that is why what you find is that you have more and more agencies coming up. The contractors could be some of them registered and whatever it is, and maybe showing some set of people at what levels of wages they are being employed and all of that. But we have absolutely, and that is a story by itself which you don't want to get into, there's no time for that. But there's a long story in this country about non-investment in certain very crucial administrative things, and that is of monitoring, that is of having all of these things, because you have to make labor monitors. You need to have these people who actually monitor all of these things. So over a long period of time, from 50s onwards, the numbers of people who are administratively employed to monitor all of these things have declined, whereas the numbers who are coming into this thing has phenomenally increased. So we have a huge administrative problem in this country which is not being tackled. So it cannot be done at the level of the security person. It has to be done about the person who is employing and how that employer is being taken to task for what he or she is doing or not.
And my point is, is the government aware of this problem going on?
That is a political question.
Are they closing it?
Yeah, right. Yes. So thank you all, and I'm sure we've had a good session, and I think Kalai deserves a very big hand.